My daughter's future in-laws flew in from Europe to meet us. They smiled to my face, but they spoke German the whole dinner, completely convinced I wouldn't understand a single word. Then I heard what they really thought of my daughter, and I set down my fork. Before I tell you what I did next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand up to arrogant people who underestimated you, hit like. I'm Michael, 72 years old. For the past decade, since my wife Patricia passed away, my world has revolved around my daughter Rachel. She's 31, a brilliant architect and, or so she thought, deeply in love. The evening started with clinking crystal at a high-end steakhouse, the kind of place where the lighting is dim enough to hide the prices. I sat across from my future son-in-law, Klaus, and his parents, Hinrich and Marta, freshly landed from Munich. Klaus had painted me as a simple, retired blue-collar man who tinkered in a garage. I let him play the wealthy tech entrepreneur. I wanted nothing more than to see my daughter cherished. Halfway through dinner, Rachel excused herself. The moment her chair was empty, the warmth vanished. Hinrich and Marta leaned toward Klaus and switched into rapid Bavarian German, smiling at me the whole time, certain my quiet demeanor meant I was just a foolish old man enjoying the atmosphere. Marta called Rachel an unrefined stepping stone, as casually as she'd comment on the steak. Hinrich chuckled that her American naivety was useful for the visa. Then Klaus leaned in and told his parents they only had to endure the charade a little longer. Once Rachel signed the startup loan next week, he'd phase out the embarrassing father completely. The old man is clueless, he laughed, raising his glass. I kept chewing. I kept my face still. What none of them knew was that I'd spent 7 years stationed in Munich with the U.S. Army, then 30 years as an international logistics director negotiating ruthless contracts in Frankfurt. I don't just speak German. I speak it better than Klaus ever will. Rachel returned glowing. The bill arrived. Klaus did his practiced fake reach for his wallet, and I calmly took the folder myself. I looked at Hinrich, then Marta, then Klaus, and said in flawless German, "Don't worry about the bill. The clueless old man has it covered. Enjoy your stepping stone." Klaus went white. Marta's fork clattered to her plate. Hinrich's mouth fell open. I stood, kissed Rachel's cheek, and walked out without another word. But Rachel hadn't understood a word of German. All she'd seen was her father saying something harsh and walking out on the most important dinner of her life. She caught me at the valet stand, furious, humiliated, demanding to know what I'd said. I told her gently that those people weren't who she thought, that what they'd said about her was unforgivable. Before I could explain, Klaus came sprinting out, playing devastated. He wrapped his arm around her, called it a misunderstanding, and told her his mother had used an old Bavarian phrase, that Rachel was their foundation stone, their anchor, and that the visa comment was just a clumsy joke about paperwork. It was flawless. He turned venom into sugar in front of my eyes. When I insisted I knew exactly what I'd heard, he twisted the knife further, accusing me of being a bitter, lonely father who couldn't stand losing his daughter, who was sabotaging her happiness to punish parents who'd flown 5,000 miles for her. He weaponized my grief. He weaponized Patricia's memory. Rachel's trust in me cracked in real time. Exhausted, 4 weeks from her wedding, desperate to believe her fairy tale was real, she told me flatly, if I couldn't accept the man she loved, I wasn't welcome at the wedding. Not until I apologized to Klaus, Hinrich, and Marta. "Mom would be so ashamed of you," she said, and it landed harder than any blow I'd taken in 72 years. Over her shoulder, where she couldn't see, Klaus's grieving mask dropped for half a second. He smirked. He'd successfully isolated me from her. I knew if I pushed, I'd lose her forever. Gaslighting thrives on chaos, and Klaus wanted me to look unhinged, so I gave him the opposite of what he expected. I slumped my shoulders, told Rachel quietly I'd give her space, got in my car, and drove away, letting them believe the old man had surrendered. He hadn't. A man who spent 30 years surviving cutthroat international contracts doesn't surrender. He regroups. He gathers intelligence. And Klaus had just handed me the one thing I needed most: time. For 4 days I played the defeated father, texting Rachel a clumsy apology, promising to stay out of the wedding until she was ready to talk. It was the hardest lie I'd ever told, but arrogance always makes mistakes, and I intended to wait for his. It came on a rainy Tuesday while I was deep cleaning my kitchen, trying to keep my hands busy. Under the fruit bowl, tucked beneath a stack of old mail, I found a thick cream-colored paper folded in thirds, the same heavy stock Klaus had waved around weeks earlier, boasting about letters of intent from European venture capitalists. I'd assumed it was more of his posturing and let it be. Now I unfolded it and put on my reading glasses. It wasn't a letter of intent. It was a final notice from a corporate bank in Munich, a bank I recognized from my logistics years. In precise, unforgiving German legal language, it demanded immediate repayment of over 400,000 euros, citing missed deadlines and broken agreements. And buried in the second paragraph was a word that stopped my heart: fraud. The loan had been secured with fabricated collateral and falsified projections. His accounts were frozen. Criminal referral was threatened if the balance wasn't settled by month's end. The deadline was exactly 2 weeks away, 3 days after the wedding. Klaus wasn't rushing this marriage for love. He was a fugitive racing a debt clock, and he needed Rachel's signature before his creditors caught up with him. Hinrich and Marta hadn't come to celebrate a union. They'd come to secure their son's bailout, laughing at my daughter as the vehicle for it. I photographed every inch of that document, locked the original in my safe, and picked up the phone to call someone I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, Evelyn Cross, the most ruthless corporate attorney I'd ever worked with. She'd known Rachel since she was a little girl. When I told her it involved Rachel, she dropped everything. "Be at my office in 20 minutes. I laid the bank notice on her desk. She read it in silence, then said the word aloud in translation: fraud. She confirmed what I feared. Klaus wasn't an entrepreneur hiding from bad luck. He was hiding from prison. She picked up the phone and called her investigator in Munich, a former intelligence officer, and gave him 2 weeks to dig up everything: bank records, police files, associates, whereabouts. Spare no expense. Then Evelyn asked the question that turned my blood cold. Klaus owed nearly €500,000. Rachel wasn't a millionaire. So what asset, sitting untouched, was about to unlock right around the wedding? Patricia, my late wife, a senior wealth manager, had spent her final months building an ironclad trust fund for Rachel, $500,000, set to release on Rachel's 32nd birthday, or on her wedding day, whichever came first. I'd forgotten the marital clause entirely. Rachel must have mentioned it to Klaus in some tender, grieving moment, never imagining she was handing a predator the location of a vault. The math was devastating. If the wedding happened before her birthday, the money would legally become joint marital property the instant they married, accessible to Klaus immediately. That's exactly why he'd spent months pressuring Rachel into moving the date up, using a fake story about ailing grandparents. It wasn't sentiment. It was a hostile takeover, timed to the day. He needed one more thing: her signature on paperwork, disguised as immigration forms, to authorize the transfer. He was already circling for the kill. By Thursday, Evelyn's investigator had torn Klaus's life open. There was no startup. He was a mid-level accountant who'd embezzled nearly €2 million from a Bavarian logistics firm through shell companies, then fled to the US on a tourist visa when charges were filed. His parents weren't wealthy. Their manufacturing business had been propped up with his stolen money and was now collapsing under its own bankruptcy filings. They'd fled to America too, hiding from their own creditors, hoping Klaus could bail them all out with Rachel's inheritance. And there was one more file. Photographs of Klaus in a Munich beer garden, arm around a woman named Lena, his real fiancé of 2 years. Intercepted emails showed his actual plan: drain Rachel's trust, pay off his debts, secure a green card, then quietly divorce her and bring Lena to America on the money he'd stolen from a dead woman's legacy. Evelyn offered to hand everything to the FBI immediately. I said no. Arrest him now, and he becomes a martyr, a misunderstood man persecuted by a jealous father-in-law. Rachel would spend years wondering if I'd ruined her life. I needed her to see the mask come off herself. So I built a trap instead. I called Klaus and asked him to come to my house alone, playing the broken, surrendering widower. I dimmed the lights, set Patricia's photo on my desk, poured untouched scotch, and let my posture collapse. When he arrived, arrogant and pitying, I told him I was wrong to have doubted him, that my fear of losing Rachel had driven me to invent terrible things. He drank it in without question. Then I offered him exactly what he wanted, $500,000 of my own money, wired directly to him, on one condition. Rachel's trust fund stayed untouched, and we'd document it as a standard legal investment, drafted by my lawyer. Klaus didn't hesitate. He shook my hand and told me, smiling, that he'd see me at the rehearsal dinner. He never suspected Evelyn Cross was the lawyer. On page 1 and 2, the contract read like a dream, boring, generic investment language, designed to bore a con man into confidence. On page 3, buried in dense clauses, was a federal financial disclosure statement. By signing, Klaus swore under penalty of perjury that he had no pending criminal investigations anywhere in the world, and beside it, a marital asset waiver, permanently severing his legal claim to Rachel's trust fund, wedding or not. I later heard the proof of exactly how deep the trap ran. Evelyn's investigator had cloned Klaus's phone. The recording captured him calling his parents the second he left my driveway, laughing that the stupid old mechanic had folded and was handing over $500,000 for nothing but a piece of paper. Marta called me pathetic. Hinrich, briefly cautious, asked what the catch was. Then, hearing there was none, ordered his son to sign immediately and take the money before the wedding even happened. They planned to take my cash today and drain Rachel's trust tomorrow anyway. Klaus signed every page in Evelyn's office in under a minute, never once looking past the dollar figure on page 1. He didn't bring a lawyer. His arrogance made the question irrelevant to him. As he handed the folder back, believing no one understood him, he muttered a Bavarian insult under his breath, calling me a pathetic old dog handing over his bones. I just smiled. The rehearsal dinner was held in a grand hotel ballroom, 50 guests, crystal and candlelight. Klaus held court all night, spinning stories of his empire. Hinrich and Marta sipped champagne, quietly mocking the venue in German, between compliments in English. I sat at the end of the table, listening, waiting. Rachel gave a toast about trust and honesty being the foundation of a marriage. Every word broke my heart a little more, knowing what he really was. Then the best man called on the father of the bride. I stood, carrying a dark leather folder instead of a speech. I told Rachel that her mother had spent her final months building a shield to protect her, and that real love never needs you to surrender that shield to prove your loyalty. Then I slid the folder in front of her and asked her to open it. She found the translated fraud warrant first, then the photograph of Klaus and his real fiancé, Lena, in Munich, then the true translation of the immigration form he'd tried to get her to sign, actually a power of attorney to drain her trust fund. Klaus erupted, calling it all lies, accusing me of hating his heritage, dropping to his knees to beg Rachel not to believe it. His parents shouted for hotel security to remove me. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked up the original bank notice and read it aloud, in flawless, unaccented Bavarian German, the exact debt, the exact statute, the word fraud, pronounced with total precision. Marta went white. Klaus realized, in that instant, that I'd understood every word they'd ever said about my daughter, from the very first night. That's when Evelyn Cross walked in. She introduced herself as senior counsel and calmly informed the room that the investment contract Klaus had signed contained a sworn federal perjury clause and a lifetime marital waiver, meaning he'd just confessed to a federal crime and permanently forfeited any claim to Rachel's money, in exchange for exactly $0, since the funding was contingent on a background check he could never pass. His visa, she added, had already been flagged for revocation. Klaus's fake empire collapsed in real time in front of 50 witnesses. Rachel stood, looked at the man she'd almost married, and told him quietly to get out of her sight, that if he ever contacted her again, my lawyer would bury him in federal charges. Hinrich and Marta slunk out without a word, their own bankruptcy and lawsuits waiting for them back home. Within weeks, federal agents detained Klaus for visa fraud, and Germany issued an extradition request tied to the embezzlement charges. He was deported in handcuffs, arriving in Munich not as an investor, but as a disgraced fugitive. His parents lost everything, their business seized, their debts finally catching up with them, the fortune they'd hoped to steal from a grieving American family gone forever. Rachel grieved quietly for a while, not for Klaus, but for the fairy tale she'd believed in. I didn't lecture her. I made coffee, kept food on the stove, and let her find her own way back. When she finally opened up, packing away the unworn wedding dress, she told me she'd gone to the bank herself and confirmed everything, how close she'd come to losing her mother's legacy, blindfolded by love. She apologized for doubting me outside the restaurant. I told her predators are dangerous precisely because they know how to mimic the people we trust most, and that her capacity to love wasn't a flaw to be hardened. It was something worth protecting, not punishing. That evening we sat on the back porch the way Patricia and I used to, watching the sky turn gold and purple. Rachel told me she was taking a month off to travel alone, to rebuild herself on her own terms. I listened, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not vindication, just peace. I kept the promise I made to Patricia 10 years ago. I didn't need to shout to prove my worth. I let them underestimate me, let them believe a quiet old man was powerless, and I let that arrogance write their own downfall. True power doesn't perform. It watches, it waits, and when the moment comes, it ends things quietly and completely. If there's one thing this taught me, it's that love without boundaries is a blueprint for disaster, and that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage you'll ever be handed. Tell me in the comments, what have you done to protect your own boundaries from people who tried to use you? And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe.